Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Anna from the TUC, and I'm joined by Paul Nowak, who I'll be handing over to shortly. So today's webinar is about, a very general topic really, about the coronavirus and the impact of the pandemic on the workplace, on unions, and on just general working life. So before we get going, just a little bit of housekeeping. You can see that there's a chat panel on the right-hand side, and it's great to see so many of you already introducing yourselves there. Please use that to exchange some tips and ideas about what we're talking about. We do have live captions today on this broadcast, and you can see underneath me and Paul, there's a green button that will open the captions in a new window. If you do that, please remember to close this window down, because if you don't, you'll get an echo. You only need to have the webinar open in one window only. Paul will be taking your questions after his presentation, and there's another button underneath this that says ask a question. Please post your questions there, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can during this webinar. If we don't get to all of them, don't worry, because we'll be taking those and putting them to our specialists in maybe health and safety or employment rights on a future webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Paul to get going.
Okay, thanks everybody, and thanks Anna, and hello to everybody, and thanks to TUC Education for the opportunity to say a few words on the webinar. I have to say, I mean, after 8 or 9 weeks now of doing Zoom meetings, Skype for Business meetings, Teams meetings, I still can't get used to this way of working, and it feels slightly weird to be sort of sitting in my shed in Birkenhead and talking to hundreds of people up and down the country. But hopefully we can get a good conversation going and have a good 90 minutes or so for us to talk about some of the issues and challenges facing unions as a result of COVID-19. I thought what I'd do is maybe speak for like 10 or 15 minutes before Anna sort of chairs a bit of a question and answer session, and we get a bit of discussion going. And I thought I'd really cover 3 main areas. First of all, just to recap on what we've done over the last 8 or 9 weeks as a movement collectively in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Secondly, to talk about some of the immediate challenges that we face as unions, the big challenges coming up for our members and workplaces up and down the country. And then third, I want to talk a little bit about how we build back better. And everybody's using this term now, the new normal, thinking about how we make sure that we shape the new normal and get it to deliver for working people and their families in a way that we desperately need to see in so many parts of our country and our economy. I mean, first thing to say, though, before I get into any of that, is just a big thanks to every union rep and activist for the work that you've done throughout this period. I mean, this is a pandemic that has affected everybody in the country, and our movement included in that. We know that there will be people on this webinar in our trade unions who've lost family and friends as a result of the pandemic. We know that people will have been ill or have cared for those who've been ill during the pandemic. We know that people have been working from home in really difficult circumstances in some cases. And we know actually that there have been millions of people who've been out at work over the course of the last 7 or 8 weeks, not quite work as usual, but going out, whether that's in our NHS, in care homes, but also in our supermarkets, delivering our parcels, making sure our utilities are running. You know, basically the real key workers who've kept the country going. So a big thanks to every single union rep and activist for the work that you've done throughout this period, because I think it's made a difference to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people's lives over the course of the last couple of months. And that really brings me to the first point of substance, because I think we can be collectively proud of the work that our unions have done over the last 8 or 9 weeks. We set out at the beginning of this pandemic with 2 key objectives in mind. Number 1, making sure we protect people's health and lives. And number 2, and linked to that absolutely, making sure we did whatever we could to protect people's jobs and livelihoods. And I'm not going to talk about every single thing that every single union has done over the course of the last couple of months, but maybe just to highlight 3 things which I think we can be proud of, and 3 things that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the trade union movement. The first is the job retention scheme, which the Chancellor announced on March the 20th. It's not perfect. There's more that we need to see from the job retention scheme, and I'll talk about that in a few moments' time. But I know that hundreds of thousands of people's jobs have been secured as a result of that job retention scheme, and it wouldn't have happened without unions. We were the first group of national organisations right at the outset of the pandemic who said that the government needed to step up and put together a significant job subsidy package to make sure that people could remain in employment throughout the crisis. Just on a personal level, I gave evidence to the Business Select Committee on March the 17th and made that case. We met with the Chancellor that week, March the 18th. Our teams went into the Treasury on March the 19th, and on March the 20th, the Chancellor announced the job retention scheme. A week later, we got the self-employed income support scheme, and those schemes have kept people in employment through a really difficult time. And I think collectively as unions, we have to take credit for that, because there is no way that a Chancellor, indeed a Conservative Chancellor, would have put in place a scheme like the job retention scheme if it wouldn't have been for all the work that our unions put in, arguing, making the case for, lobbying for that sort of support and scheme. Second thing we've done alongside people securing people's jobs is securing people's health. And again, I think we can be proud that across a whole range of different sectors, we've been working with the Departments of Business and other parts of government to develop guidance on what safe systems of work should look like. And this has been a difficult process. The first iteration of guidance that came out didn't mention trade unions, didn't mention risk assessments. And I'm glad that thanks to the efforts of all of our unions that were involved in working, whether it was non-food retail or distribution or factories, the work that we've produced with the guidance that BEIS produced with the support and the engagement of unions and employers, I think will have kept hundreds of thousands of people safe at work. And that has some fundamental things in there that we push for. So employers now, there's an expectation that not only will they carry out risk assessments, they'll have to publish those risk assessments on their website and, if you like, shine a light into what they've done to try and put in place safe systems of work. Up front in the guidance, it talks about the need to engage unions and safety reps, and where they aren't present, to engage with employees. And we've also made sure that that section on PPE, protective equipment, makes clear that if a risk assessment identifies that PPE is required, then that's what an employer needs to provide. And we've done that across the Department of Business. We're in the process at the moment with Departments of Culture, Media and Sport, thinking about what does a safe system of work look like in everything from theatres to cinemas to theme parks to a whole range of different work settings. And we're also crucially talking to the Department of Transport about public transport. And just today, our education unions and Francis O'Grady, our General Secretary, are meeting with Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of State for Education, to think about what we need to do to put in place systems that make sure that as we begin to reopen our schools, we're keeping kids safe, but we're also keeping people who work in schools safe. You'll have seen a lot about that in the media. Happy to talk about that in questions and answers. But our union is being very clear. This is not about setting arbitrary dates for reopening schools. It's doing that in a way that keeps everybody, parents, kids, staff, as safe as possible. So we've done a huge amount of work in terms of developing those safe systems of work, building on the work of our army of health and safety reps who are the experts in workplace safety and health. Third thing I just mentioned in terms of what we've done already is that we've been working across a huge range of sectors. I mean, you couldn't name a sector of the economy where unions have been engaged from the workplace up in trying to secure jobs, to secure the future of employers and the organisations that our members work for. And it doesn't matter whether it's the work that USDOR's done with the British Retail Consortium, the work our aviation unions have done with a whole range of airlines, a really difficult sector, the work I mentioned just before in theatre and entertainment. I mean, our unions have really stepped up to the plate. And again, I think we can take comfort to the fact that it's our efforts that have resulted in people staying in jobs, maintaining their incomes and being able to support their families. So we've done a huge amount of work. I'm not going to mention it all. There's lots more I could mention, including the fact that, for example, we managed to win sick pay from day one, right at the outset of the crisis. Lots that we've done, but we know some big immediate challenges facing us, our members and our unions as we go forward. I'll keep this brief, but, big issues around that job retention scheme. We're going to see the Chancellor make some announcements over the course of the next couple of days about the future of the job retention scheme. We've been very clear that we needed to have more flexibility in it so that we can start to bring people back to work, but still support employers and employees alike as we do so. Making the case that in some sectors, the JRS may need to run for longer, depending on the loosening of the lockdown sector by sector. But crucially, The job retention scheme not being the only thing that's on the table in supporting sectors and companies as we move forward, because we know that there are some sectors of our economy, it doesn't matter whether it's tourism and hospitality, I mentioned aviation before, that are going to be under real pressures, and we want to see government step up to the plate and support those sectors, but do so in a way that engages unions and employers, so that we have support for employers that is based on some conditions, and the key condition being retaining people in employment and making sure we have a sustainable future for the sector going forward. So job retention scheme, sectoral packages of support, really important. Unfinished business on sick pay. 2 million people in this country still not eligible for sick pay because they don't earn enough. Even when they do earn enough, sick pay of £95 a week just isn't enough. And we know, for example, we've just seen the test and trace announcement today. If that's going to have any sort of teeth at all, people shouldn't have to choose between following public health guidelines and paying the bills. And so we need to see sick pay paid at least the rate of the national living wage, so that people can self-isolate if they've got symptoms or they've been identified as part of the test and trace system. So unfinished business on sick pay. Unfinished business, I think, in terms of the impact, the quality impact of the virus. We know that BME staff in our hospitals and in our care homes have been disproportionately hit by COVID-19. We know that women are being disproportionately hit by the virus in terms of more likely to be furloughed, more likely to be facing challenges going back to work because of childcare and so on. And we know that some of our members, particularly those people working in lower paid jobs, more insecure employment, again, are more likely to have been disproportionately hit by COVID-19. And we not only want the government to have a proper sort of set of risk assessments around those sorts of issues, we want them to take action on those sorts of issues as well, make sure that we're not putting our members in harm's way. So lots of things that we need to do in the immediate term alongside, and I think we need to stress this, holding the government account for some of its failings. I mean, whether it's PPE, and we've called for an inquiry, a public inquiry into the government's failure to get to grips with the crisis in PPE, whether it's what they've done or not done in care homes in terms of keeping the elderly and the people who work in those care homes safe, whether it's the failure to implement a proper testing and track and trace system earlier than the one that we've seen so far, whether it was the Prime Minister making that announcement a couple of Sundays ago about people returning to work before we had the guidance on safe systems of work, or before we had the public transport plan, or before we had a plan for our schools. All these things we'll need to hold the government to account on and make sure that they're doing what's best for working people, their families and communities. But beyond the immediate term, we also need to think about what does that new normal look like, and what more do we want to see in terms of the government taking action and employers taking action to make sure that the world of work looks better as we emerge from the COVID-19 crisis. And I'll finish maybe on these points, Anna, because yes, we've got some immediate challenges in terms of securing people's jobs and livelihoods, but I think this is an opportunity for us to reset our economy. We have seen this crisis expose some of the big divisions and inequalities in our society and in our workplaces. And so just last Monday, we published a comprehensive plan. You can see it's called TUC, A Better Recovery, if you search for that in Google. But it sets out what a comprehensive plan for rebuilding the UK economy post-COVID-19 should look like. At the heart of that plan, we're calling for the government to set up a National Recovery Council, bringing together government, employers, unions to actually map out how we build a better future going forward. So decent work at its heart, a ban on 0 hours contracts, £10 an hour minimum wage, equality at its heart, making sure the government takes seriously that public sector equality duty and that people have the day one right to flexible working, a real safety net. I mean, I think this crisis has exposed the problems that we knew were there with universal credit and what happens when you suck funds out of that social security system. So a proper safety net for everybody so that no one should fear losing their job or being sick or unwell. Crucially, rebuilding our public services and rebuilding not just our NHS, but local governments as well. I mean, I'm talking to you today from Birkenhead. The Liverpool City region estimates that something like local councils will be down around about £250 million in terms of what they've had to pay out in the midst of this COVID crisis and what they can expect in funding from central government. That's just not sustainable in Liverpool or anywhere else. So we need a proper funding settlement for all our public services, including local government, and an end to outsourcing. And crucially, now's the time for an industrial strategy worthy of the name, an industrial strategy that allows us to emerge from post-COVID, from COVID-19 with some confidence, that allows us to meet our obligations around net zero and decarbonising our economy, that allows us to get to grips with the sort of post-Brexit scenario that we're going to be facing, and an industrial strategy that puts good quality, sustainable employment at its absolute heart. Now, if we're going to deliver that plan for a better recovery, then the thing I think we can do most, that's most important and most pressing, that gets government to pay attention to what we're saying, that gets employers to pay attention to what we're saying, is to build a stronger trade union movement. Now, we had some good news this week. Trade union membership grew for the third year on the row. 200,000 new members over the course of the last 3 years. That's something we should celebrate, but it's not in any way something that gives us any room for complacency whatsoever, because we know we got some massive membership challenges. Hopefully we can talk about some of those in the questions and the discussion. But for my mind, the best way of securing a good future post-COVID-19 is building a stronger trade union movement. More members, more activists in more workplaces, delivering for more working people. That's got to be our number one objective. I think we've demonstrated the value of unions throughout this period of crisis, not just to individual workers, but to the UK economy and our society as a whole. Let's spread trade unionism now into every part of the economy, give that trade union voice to as many workers as possible. And that way, I think we can look forward to the future with confidence. That's enough of a rant from me from the shed. I'll hand back over to Anna. I know she's got lots of questions and comments in the comment section, so maybe let's just get into those if we can, Anna.
Sure. Thank you, Paul. I don't know whether you've got an eye on the chat as well, but people are saying how helpful it was to hear all the union successes summarised so sort of succinctly. We've had a lot over the past 10 weeks, and I think we should all be proud of those for sure. But the first question that we've had is that what do you think union reps can do to build on these successes we've had in getting our messages across? Because we could say that like some of these successes are kind of on the macro level, aren't they? And reps are in the individual workplaces. So how can they build on this and promote the value of unions?
Well, I think that the most important thing, Anna, is tell people what we do and tell people about the value of being a union member. And it doesn't matter, whether it's at the level of the individual workplace or whether it's the work that we do with government and all the rest of it. Quite often people take for granted the stuff that we do. So that job retention scheme is a classic example. It would have secured the jobs of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, over 8 million people now on the job retention scheme. Lots of people who won't be union members covered by that job retention scheme. Lots of people just thinking this was a great initiative by government. It wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for us. So, I think the key thing is if you're a union rep, thinking about what we can do. I mean, we talk a lot about reaching into unorganized part of the private sector or part of the private sector with low union density, and that's really important. But we know there are large parts of the economy in both the public and private sector where people have unions in the workplace, and we negotiate their pay terms and conditions, and we do stuff like work with their employees on risk assessments to keep them safe, but there are still people in the workplace who aren't union members. And so the key thing I'd say is we still need to go out and talk to people, ask them to join the union, talk to them about the benefits of trade unions and demonstrate to them what it is unions have done. Crucially, I've got 3 kids now, working age, all at work. In different types of workplaces, and I know all too often they go to work, and the sorts of workplaces I've got. My son works in a PCS workplace in the DWP. Everyone there is a union member, near enough. They see the union rep day in, day out. You can see the value of the union. My daughter works in a non-union call centre, and they don't see that value. And I think we've got to do what we can to reach out to our friends and families and spread that union message. And sometimes not to be funny about it, but we can be a little bit shy, can't we, asking people to join the union and feel a little bit embarrassed. Bloody hell, if there was ever a time now to sort of shout loud and proud about what it is unions do and the difference we make, I think this is it. And frankly, we are going to face some massive challenges coming up over the next few months. We'll be fighting for every single job, and we're only going to succeed in doing that successfully if we got as many people joining a union as possible. So don't be shy. Now's the time to raise the union voice and the union banner.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. You mentioned there about celebrating the wins. We did publish a few weeks ago a guide to organising and promoting the union during this COVID-19 situation. It's an online 5-minute guide, and hopefully Alice will post that in the chat in a few seconds. Well, give her a minute or so to look it up and she can post that in the chat. Okay.
Can I make another plug as well while we're on, Anna?
Go for it.
On July 9th to the 11th, we're going to be running a thing called Organise 2020, which will be a 3-day online organising festival. And there'll be 30 sessions run across those 3 days. Everything from how do we organise more effectively online through to how do we develop women activists and bring more women into leadership in the movement, through to how do we organise against the far right? How do we organise through supply chains? How can unions better work together? I mean, frankly, anything and everything you could possibly think about union organising. If people go onto the TUC website, look at events, pre-register for Organise 2020. We'll have more information on the website next week about the sort of sessions that we'll be running. But that will be a real opportunity to celebrate some of our successes, but also think about how we scale up our organising work, because the crucial thing for me is building on that success of the 200,000 new members over 3 years. Because, as I say, it doesn't matter whether it's trying to influence government or influence employers. We only do that when we've got more union members.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. Speaking of this rise that we've seen in the past 3 years, have you noticed if there are any rises in particular sectors, or have you got anything to say about the fact that maybe more women are joining unions than have done in previous time periods?
Yeah, I think a big chunk of those 200,000 net new members were women. I think 174,000 women members. And I think that reflects the fact that I think unions have got much better at reaching out into the public sector in particular, because that's where the main drivers for that membership growth have come from. I think that's something we absolutely have to celebrate. I think the next job for us is to bring more of those members into activism and to get more women taking on leadership positions and reps positions in branches and so on, because we know our rep space still isn't as representative as we want it to be. So that's a big challenge. And I think, again, for any union rep out there, doing what we can to identify the next layer of reps, the next generation of reps coming forward is really important. It does pose a big challenge about the private sector, though, Anna, and you know, we've got some areas where we organise in the private sector really effectively. If you think about some of the big supermarket chains, for example, the work that the likes of Usdaw, Unite, the GMB have done in Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda to bring people into union membership, we should absolutely celebrate. But the rest of retail, it's 90% near enough unorganised. So there's more that we need to do to reach out into those parts of the private sector that haven't been well unionised in the past, but which we know are going to be key sectors of the economy going forward. So I think lots of positives we can take from those membership statistics, but lots of challenges as well going forward. And as I say, none of this happens by accident. I mean, it requires us to go out and actively make building membership a priority. And I think hopefully Organise 2020 will give us an opportunity to promote that message.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Paul. I think Alice has just posted the link to
Alice.
Registration for that, for the organising. I think we're calling it Organising Festival in July.
Yeah, Organising 2020.
The Organising 2020 Festival. So we've had a really interesting question about an opportunity for unions. Let me just try and find it. Here we go. So the question asks, we're currently not able to undertake workplace ballots because the scrutiny isn't operating. Could this be an opportunity for trade unions to convince the government to introduce online voting for industrial action, especially with perhaps, you know, we've all got to stay distant from each other. Many of us are at home.
Yeah, I mean, this is a little bit of a hangover from that Trade Union Act, isn't it? Which we know was a really pernicious, unfair piece of legislation. The one slight glimmer of hope in it was that the government agreed that they would run some pilots around online balloting, which is really important, not just in this environment, although obviously for obvious reasons now, and the fact that people in many cases aren't in workplaces, online balloting, I think, is an idea whose time has come. We have flagged that issue with the Department of Business and made absolutely that case that now is the time for us to think innovatively about how we use online ballots, and it's something that will continue to push. I know lots of unions have had to think imaginatively about union democracy in this sort of period. We've now agreed that our Congress this year, it won't be the normal Congress we have in Brighton in September. It'll be a hybrid Congress, if you like. So we'll have a shorter Congress with a focus on online sessions where we'll hear from the General Secretary and senior politicians, but the General Counsel doing some of the business of Congress. But other unions have thought about how they do their conferences online, virtually, and in different ways. But yeah, absolutely, something we'll continue to push the Department of Business on. And also something I think that unions themselves just need to think about: how do we use online more imaginatively going forward? Because the new normal, we know, will require us to think much more virtually, not just about physical events. I have to say, I like this sort of thing, but I also like the face-to-face stuff and being in a room with people, and hopefully we'll get back to doing that in the not too distant future as well. But I mean, certainly, we've got just short of 500 people on this webinar now. I think it's a brilliant sort of resource for us to think, how I know you've been doing these on a regular basis for the TUC and for unions, Anna, as well. But the fact we've got 500 people on a Thursday afternoon to talk about union stuff, I think is brilliant. And so we shouldn't lose some of the positives that we can take out of the last few weeks.
Absolutely, yeah. The numbers are fantastic, but I think it's about getting a balance, isn't it? We, at the moment, everything is like this. And it was the speed with which it changed. It's about getting that balance. Okay, another good question we've had is that before the COVID-19 pandemic, facility time was under attack, and we knew that facility time was dropping year on year. What could we do to reverse this trend?
Well, first of all, I think it's a trend that we do need to reverse. And I think I'd say the first thing we need to do is to push the issue with employers, because all too often facility time is the stuff that gets almost eroded in a sort of quiet way. I mean, we had that as part of the Trade Union Act, the assault on facility time in public services. But I think as a first step, a workplace level for a union, it's map out the facility time that you've got. Think about what it is you need to properly represent your members. That ACAS code of practice there sets out, what reasonable facility time is. And we need to be thinking about, if you like, pushing employers on this issue, because ultimately, in the vast majority of cases, this is something of very low cost to employers, of huge benefit to our members, but I'd actually argue a huge benefit to employers as well. And we've crunched all the figures. Again, you'll be able to search for this, but we've done work over the years which demonstrates the value of union facility time, not just to unions and to individual workers, but to employers as well, in terms of reduced absenteeism, better employment relations, better productivity, and so on. But I'd start out with mapping the facility time that we've got, having confidence that the facility time we do secure from employers we're making the best use of. Are we using it to build the union? Are we using it to collectivize issues? Are we using it to bring on that next generation of reps? Different models of facility time will suit different unions in different workplaces. But I'm keen to see facility time being used to develop new reps and to give and encourage people to come forward as reps as well. And I think we have to make the argument that even as we do more online training, and trade union education has done a huge amount of online training, that doesn't remove employers of their obligations to provide facility time to reps. So yes, online training allows people to do training and get information and briefings more flexibly and online and so on, but we should still be pushing employers on those issues as well. Final thought, Anna, just on facility time, where there's more than one union, I can't overstate the importance of unions working together to make sure that we use facility time as effectively as possible. Nobody benefits when we have, sort of fallout between unions about effective use of facility time. So I think 99% of cases, unions work together well at a local level, and the more we can do to encourage that, the better, because, ultimately it's about representing all of our members. And I always believe as a movement, we grow together. And so, we've got some really good examples in sectors like education of unions working together on issues like facility time. The more we can do that, the better.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. And we at TUC Education, we do have a great online resource about facility time, how you can map what you already have, as Paul mentioned, and how you can improve it. And Alice has just posted a link to that in the chat. We also have some resources on general workplace mapping, so not just facility time mapping, but general mapping of the workplace as well, which is part of all our courses because it's such an important rep activity. Okay, Paul, bit of a change of subject now. So
I'm worried now, Anna.
Don't worry, nothing to worry about. We've all seen in the news that the pandemic may particularly hit hard the employment of younger people. So is there anything that unions can do to help younger workers get back into better employment than they perhaps had before, or that they are doing during the pandemic?
Yeah, well, one of the key things that we've been pushing the government on, Anna, is something we're calling the jobs guarantee scheme. So I am particularly worried about that next layer of school leavers, college leavers, university graduates, and the fears about them going straight into unemployment. But also, we know the young people who were at work 2.5 times more likely to work in a sector of the economy that's been closed down. And so I think it's in everybody's interest to make sure that we do everything we can to get young people into work and back into good quality work as well. So key thing we're doing is pushing the government on that jobs guarantee scheme. And I think the more that we can amplify, unions sort of taking that message to government as well, I think really important. I would like to see, as I said before, sector by sector, employers, as part of the packages of support that they might get from the government going forward, having to agree, if you like, jobs and industry plans with unions about how we're going to secure employment in this sector, including, for example, how we make sure we don't have a generation of apprenticeships missed out. It would be the easy thing in a way for employers in the short term to think about cutting costs and to cut programs like apprenticeships. I absolutely think that unions have to put that on the table with employers and say, yes, we need to manage through these really difficult times together, but we've also got to make that commitment to bringing through the next generation of workers as well. So, and that then goes on to some practical things like, where we've got apprentices, making sure they can finish those apprentice programs, making sure that they've got jobs to go to. This is all going to be really difficult stuff, but I've got confidence in unionized workplaces that where we've got unions sitting down with employers, we'll be able to work through some of this stuff. Less confidence in other parts of the economy, if I'm being absolutely honest. And this is where we will need to sort of put the pressure on government to think about what support are you offering in a sector like hospitality, for example, where unions aren't bargaining with employers right across the piece. But it's key. I grew up in Merseyside in the 80s and early 90s. And we had a generation of young people who basically sort of left school and went straight onto the dole. And we know how difficult it is to then get people back into employment. So we don't want to be waiting 6 months, 12 months to get people into jobs. We need people into jobs now, and we need those to be good quality jobs. So again, one of the things that we put forward in that Better Recovery report is about giving people basic security at work. We know things like 0 hours contracts disproportionately hit young people. We know low pay disproportionately hits young people. That's why we need a £10 an hour minimum wage and why we need a ban on 0 hours contracts and a ban on bogus self-employment, because I reckon the next generation of workers deserve terms and conditions just as good as the people that went before them.
They absolutely do, Paul. Yes, but that you were specifically addressing young people's issues there, but we've also had a question about regional recovery as well. So the question asks, what plans are in place post-COVID recovery for the economy and jobs in the regions, particularly with the predicted redundancies in manufacturing and the real redundancies that we've already seen in aviation?
Well, I think there's two questions there, isn't it? What plans are there in place, and what plans should there be in place? And I don't think I don't think the government has got those plans in place now. Our Better Recovery report was absolutely aimed at shaping those plans. And one thing I should say is that we are talking to government at probably a more intensive way now in the last few weeks and months than we have done over the previous years. And I think the job retention scheme actually is a really good example of where unions brought their practical experience to bear. And you would hope that government would listen to us on some of these bigger issues about moving forward. I mentioned before this National Recovery Council. We think that that's the first step. It's about us sitting down with employers and government and saying, where are the real pressure points in the economy? Where do we think that people despite all the best efforts of government and employers, we're going to have pressures on employment. And what can we put in place now to make sure that, first of all, we're preventing redundancies, but also making sure that we're smooth into the transition where there are the occasions where we can't save people's jobs. The regions and the nations absolutely have to have a key input into that. And I know our regional TUCs will be looking in, whether it's Liverpool City region, Greater Manchester, the Midlands, where we've got a Conservative mayor, but our unions are well plugged in. We'll be working with those combined authorities and devolved authorities to try and make sure that we're influencing those recovery plans. I have a little bit of a concern that in some parts of the country, if I think about some parts of the southwest, I know reports from our regional secretary, Nigel Costley there, it's not obvious that the architecture exists to have really effective, if you like, subnational interventions. And we've got to make sure that government doesn't leave those parts of the country behind. But it does also speak to some of the issues I was talking about before, because we had big problems before COVID-19 came along in terms of decarbonising our economy and coping with the move towards automation and digitalisation. And we've made the point that actually some parts of the economy where we know that those big industrial transitions will hit hardest will be least well equipped to deal with those challenges. Parts of Yorkshire and the Humber, parts of the northeast where people are still recovering from the last wave of industrial change and transition, never mind the coming wave of industrial change. So this is where government, I think, will have to step up and make those big investments in infrastructure, in physical infrastructure, but also in social infrastructure. So I mentioned public services before, but also in education, in training, in some of the things that we know. A just transition to a net zero economy isn't going to happen by accident. We can't afford to leave this to the market and hope that the market will take care of it, because actually we know that's going to result in people losing their jobs and people being displaced. If you think about renewable technologies, lots of exciting new opportunities, but far too many of those jobs are minimum wage and insecure. So I would hope that the government, and this is difficult for a Conservative government to get to grips with, I appreciate, and it's not their comfort zone, but they are going to have to try and work with the unions and employers to try and get to grips with these issues and to tackle them at root source rather than waiting for the problems to come down the line. I think it also means us holding the government to account where it doesn't step up to the plate, and we'll be working with the opposition and with Labour to make sure that they do exactly that, because we do need proper scrutiny of a government. In a time of crisis, more than ever, you need the government to be held to account for the decisions it makes.
It certainly does. And we've all seen the work that we at the TUC and the wider movement have been doing in the past few weeks. We've had a question that relates to the rise in membership. So the question asks that in their particular workplace during the COVID crisis, the membership has doubled from 52 to over 110, which is an incredible rise. However, they have problems with recognition in their workplace of the union. Can the TUC do anything with the government lobbying Westminster to make this process easier and perhaps more fluid?
I wish, and we're trying, is the short answer to that one, Anna. I mean, we've made the case consistently, actually, that you need to make union recognition much easier. There's all sorts of legal hoops that unions have to jump through for recognition. And what those legal hoops mean is that when we've got an employer that's determined not to recognise a union, they can delay the process, and by delaying the process, frustrate the process of a union securing recognition. And so we've called, for example, for the trigger threshold for recognition to be lowered for unions to be able to gain access for recognition in smaller workplaces and so on. If I'm 100% honest, I don't think we're going to get a short-term change from the government on that issue. So we need to do what we can right now with the tools that we've got to make recognition, to put recognition on the table. Some interesting stuff that is coming down the line, I think, as a result of the Taylor report into modern employment practices, the threshold for information and consultation arrangements being triggered has gone right down to. I think it's. I'll get this figure wrong, so maybe Alice or you can correct me in the comments section. But it's either 2% of the workforce. I think it is 2% of the workforce will be able to trigger a request for information and consultation arrangements. Now, information and consultation arrangements are not trade union recognition and are not a substitute for trade union recognition, but it's the first opportunity for us to demonstrate the value of a union. So unions thinking imaginatively about how we use I&C, But I also think about using the recognition procedures. I mean, our unions now have got a huge wealth of experience in terms of using the recognition legislation to try and secure recognition, to put pressure on employers to not frustrate the process. And I think ultimately that's what we're going to have to, the government isn't going to change this in the short term, no matter how much we push. So I mean, absolutely brilliant that people have managed to double the union membership. Now is the time to use that momentum, if you like, to build recognition and to get round the table with the employer. And I would have thought actually a good, sensible employer, and sometimes employers veer from being sensible or not so sensible and good and bad. Any employer worth their salt now, I think, will recognise the value a union is going to bring to a workplace. I mean, some of this stuff about risk assessments, the value a union safety rep can bring to that process to give people confidence that safe systems of work are being put in place, that people's lives aren't being put at risk. A decent employer will recognise that value and hopefully act on it.
Yes, I think that is worth saying, and we hope that they will, and that we maybe will see changes eventually. Like you said, we're trying, but we can't.
Okay, can I say something? One more thing on that, Anna. Just people keep an eye on the TUC website next week, because we'll be publishing something really exciting about being able to name and shame employers who don't meet their obligations around those risk assessments and stepping up to the plate on health and safety, including those who don't have union recognition. So if you've got an employer that isn't playing the game, that isn't engaging staff in the risk assessments, that is paying fast and loose with people's safety, check out the TUC website next week. There'll be an opportunity for you to make sure that employer is brought to public attention, because frankly, if employers aren't doing the right thing, then we want to make sure that as many people know about that as possible, including customers, including the broader public, because COVID-19 is no joke. It impacts our members' health and safety, and we want to make sure employers are doing the right thing.
That sounds like a great tool, and so we look forward to seeing that next week. Okay, we've heard a lot in the news in recent weeks about the new initiative from the government about track and trace, and hopefully if track and trace is rolled out, it might start to change our daily lives a little bit more. Have you got any general comments to make about how that might impact workplaces, and how that might affect our members if they are told by the track and trace system that they perhaps need to self-isolate, or in fact, if they are diagnosed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is one of the things that we'll be pushing government on, but there's something we can do with employers as well, Anna. I mentioned it before. I mean, statutory sick pay is what, £95 a week. 2 million people aren't entitled to statutory sick pay, so we'll get nothing at all if they're sick. Now, with this new track and trace system, people who are self-isolate, who are told via the app they should self-isolate because they've been in contact with somebody for more than 15 minutes within 2 meters, will be told to self-isolate, and they'll be entitled to SSP. The key thing for us in unionised workplaces is we don't have to settle for SSP, and we know in lots of workplaces people will go home on full contractual sick pay. We've already reached that agreement with lots and lots of employers. We should make sure in every single workplace, if people are sent home because they're told to self-isolate, or they're told, or they have to go home because they've got the symptoms of coronavirus and therefore are ill, they should be going home on their full pay, and we should be pushing employers on that point. We'll be pushing the government on that point more broadly as well, because frankly, we could end up in a really difficult situation where somebody is told to self-isolate and frankly can't afford to self-isolate because they can't afford to go down to £95 a week. That's not good for individuals, and it's not good for public health. So we think government needs to move on that, and we'll push government. But in the meantime, the one thing we can do in unionised workplaces is make the case that actually people who are told to self-isolate, people who will go home ill, should go home on the rate of pay that they're entitled to, not on SSP. That'll be difficult in some sectors, but I think it's absolutely crucial. And again, I would hope that there will be employers out there who would recognise that this is part about giving people the confidence to come into work knowing it's safe, and to also to self-isolate when they're asked to do so, because that's, it's no use government ministers exhorting people to think about their civic duty, because civic duty doesn't pay the bills, doesn't pay for food, and doesn't put clothes on kids' back. So let's make sure that everybody who has to go home does so on a decent rate of pay. Thanks,
Paul. So we've actually already answered a questions about a huge range of subjects. We've covered all sorts of things. Just a couple of questions that have been posted that we haven't got to, particularly address the inequalities of the pandemic. I know that Alice has posted links to a couple of reports that the TUC have published about this, how particularly it might affect women or Black and minority ethnic workers who are disproportionately affected by the pandemic. So hopefully you can, viewers, you can find some information there. Before we move on to the final question, Paul, did you want to add any comments to that about how the inequalities of this pandemic have been kind of exaggerated and emphasised in a way they weren't before?
Well, I mean, there's a huge range of issues, isn't there, Anna? I mean, we talked about some of them. I mean, I know our unions in public services, not just health, but in public services generally, are concerned about the absolute toll that the pandemic has had on Black and ethnic minority workers. I know that Public Health England are doing a big piece of work to sort of try and understand the reasons behind that. But for us, so that's in the health service in particular, for us, it's not just enough to do the impact assessments or to assess what's happened. It's absolutely putting in measures now to protect people at work. So I would hope as soon as that PHE report is published, that we'll see practical action taken with our unions and employers to implement stuff that's going to keep people safe at work. We know that it's going to be some of our members who are in lower paid jobs, not lower skilled jobs by any stretch of the imagination, lower paid jobs. And I think it's really important that any risk assessments, and risk assessment should be an ongoing process rather than just a one-off. Risk assessments are thinking about the equality impacts of COVID-19 and what we need to do to keep particularly groups of staff safe, whether it's staff who might have disabilities or it's staff in certain types of jobs. But ultimately, these are our members, and we want to keep them safe. I mean, beyond the immediate safety issues, there are some other issues. I think that certainly, again, I'm hoping in the next week or two, the TUC will be doing more work on, for example, childcare. And what is the impact going to be, particularly for women, as we see more sectors of the economy loosen the lockdown, more people returning to work, but not everyone's kids are going to be back in school or certainly in nursery settings. So what are we going to be able to put in place with employers and again with government to make sure that women aren't placed in this really difficult position where they've got childcare responsibilities, but they're also potentially sort of being asked by their employer to go back to work. So lots of different equality aspects of this. Our equalities team, unions equality teams are really working hard on these sorts of issues. And I think, this for me is a really good example of equality issues being 100% front and center mainstream issues, because, it's no use agreeing a general approach to safe systems of work if it means that certain groups of workers are going to be disproportionately impacted. I mean, that cuts across everything that we believe and fight for in the trade union movement. So, there will be certainly more work that we'll be doing on this over the next few weeks. And I think the more really good examples we've got of unions working with employers to get sort of agreements in place and approaches in place to protect people, the better.
Thank you, Paul. Any final words in sum up, because time has flown. We've been on air for almost 50 minutes and we've covered so much important information. But have you got any final words before we sign off for the day?
I mean, I started off by thanking everybody, Anna, for the work that they've done. And I mean, honestly, this 8 weeks, I think, has been really difficult for anybody who's been active and involved in the trade union movement. But I am honestly just amazed and humbled by the work that our unions have done over this sort of period of time. And sometimes doing sort of my sort of job, you sort of think, are we really making a difference in workplaces, and are we really cutting through? And I absolutely know, because of what we've been doing as reps, activists, officers, TUC unions over the last couple of months, that actually people's jobs have been saved as a result of what we've been doing. People have been able to pay the bills as a result of what we've been doing. People's lives have been saved as a result of what we've been doing. And what this has demonstrated is the absolute power and value of trade unions. And so I think I couldn't stress that enough. I mean, the next few months are going to be really difficult. I don't think anyone can shy away from that. We are heading into certainly a recession, potentially a depression. And we're going to have to fight hard for every single job and for every single person's livelihood, I think, over the next few months. And I've got confidence the movement is up for that. but it's going to require us to work together in a way that we've never done before. Last word to everybody out there: take care of yourself, take care of your loved ones, your friends, your family, the people that you work alongside. Unions ultimately are about people and the trade union family, and I'm proud to be part of this family and proud of everything that we've done. Let's just try and make sure our family is bigger and better this time next year, because that is the thing that will make a real difference to working people and their families and communities. Thanks a lot, everybody. Hopefully this has been useful for people. I've certainly enjoyed it, and hopefully I can do another one of these if you'll let me, Anna, at some stage in the future, because I'll be as good as you at it with a bit of practice.
Absolutely. You're welcome back anytime, Paul. You've been absolutely fantastic. It just remains for me to thank you, thank everybody who's tuned in today. Thank you, Alice, for being so sterling in the chat. You have posted an immense number of resources. So, yeah, thank you to you also. As Paul said, stay safe, and we'll see you again soon for another webinar on union issues. Bye-bye for now.
See you, everybody.